I was raised up on iron sights and remember clear back when I was kinda salty that the Army started issuing red dots to soldiers. I thought that it skipped the process of becoming a master of shooting fundamentals and gave a false illusion of one's way to distinguish their skill amongst the rest. As the world and my 19-year-old brain evolved, I realized the real goal was efficiency and effectiveness. If a bad shooter was now able to qualify easier and get hits faster, it's a win-win for everyone. Even ballistic helmets have improved beyond the early days, getting stronger, lighter, and would be preferred when getting shot at. Even body armor has improved in weight and design compared to the old days of having no armor at all. There was a time when we thought a vehicle having no armor was fine, and until we realized not getting blown up was better. Maybe having a backpack to carry extra gear you might need, like extra water or ammo, is better than needing it and not having it. Since red dots do almost everything better than iron sights do, faster, brighter, sometimes stronger, and actually usable under night vision without the aid of a laser aiming device. If this was such an improvement, why didn't we just stop there? Why do we have prism sights like the ACOG or 1:6 variable power optics currently in service to fight modern wars? Most new technologies are to improve upon shortcomings provided by user feedback. Feedback that's usually paid for in blood. Even the best shooters can be outmatched by a lesser skilled shooter purely by having magnification alone. A 1X when you need it is sweet like the red dot, and some higher magnification with an etched reticle definitely has some advantages. Its evolution of technology in the right circumstances will help you see a bigger picture for the moment you'll need it. I have an old saying, no one needs magnification until they do. You don't want to be on the receiving end of someone who has a longer reach. Just like boxing, if you have the shorter reach, you'll have to get in closer to get to your advantage. Although risky trying to get in, you have no choice but to accept the fact that you could get knocked out closing in the distance. You don't want to be a loot drop for someone, do you? If I had to limit myself to only a red dot or a 1:6, I'd clearly pick the low power variable to cover more situations. So let's get out of this fantasy world and talk about the pros and cons to see if a red dot is all you need. It's been a long, cold winter for me, and I'm glad to be back to talk about red dots and magnified optics. I often hear that all you need to know is your holds, and that's technically true, but with some conditions. To avoid strawman arguments, let's first be clear that yes, if you make the correct hold out to distance, you can also get a hit, just like using a magnified optic. First, let's give an honorable mention to iron sights. Just like red dots, iron sights are super accurate when used to their full potential. With the bullet drop elevation dial, making hits out to 400 and 500 isn't too hard. With a dot turned down, you can make these same hits out to distance no problem. My beef with this mindset is the minute you don't have a range with set known distances that let you know which hold to use, most of this goes out the window. When put in the real world, even with a good zero, how will you know which hold to use if a threat pops out at an unknown distance like this? Which hold would you use here? Could you even guess what distances these are without convenient range berms or a rangefinder to guide you on? Imagine the threat's size has shrunk to a kneeling size, or even worse, a prone-sized hitbox. Now imagine this far threat on the right, who not only is in a hard-to-hit prone position, with magnification, and a good reticle to range estimate you, but also to see a low probability point of aim and impact corrections. We won't always have a convenient dust cloud or a sign of our miss location to correct our shot. Another spoil of using a shooting range. When shooting in lush woods or grassy fields like this, you get no courtesy impact hint to correct from. Be aware that a lot of confidence built at a shooting range is great and all, but won't be there to save you out past 300 yards without a way to range estimate. Outside of known distances, a red dot could give you a false sense of how effective you could actually be. Now, a lot of people will say, too often we get spoiled using bright targets that give us a precise center point of aim, so a dot appears to be just fine. With a magnified optic, this is even easier, but what if the threat isn't too easy to notice or clarify where the center mass is on the bit that you do see? Did you even notice earlier the threat next to this target? A red dot alone without a magnifier would have left you unaware of a concealed threat and dead. That was only 75 yards and you couldn't spot the threat, so imagine if we had an enemy even further away. Even if you think you'll only have to shoot inside 100 yards, how can you shoot something that you can't see? Imagine if this threat was actually laying down instead of giving you a juicy torso that you didn't even notice in the first place. In the real world, a dot alone can give you some of the same issues. In city environments, ask yourself if you realize how busy this terrain actually is. It may not seem like that many places to hide exist, but they're actually everywhere around you inside 100 yards. In between these houses, maybe under these cars, or even in these shrubs beside the houses. Not to mention the types of distances inside an urban environment may surprise you, but we'll get to that later. With the amount of moving objects, integrated vegetation, and an overload of color variations all around you, it's easy to glance right past potential danger inside 100 yards. There's a reason people don't go bum rushing through urban environments so fast. There's hidden dangers lurking that you may not be able to spot without doing a bit of magnified observation first. Nowadays, we have an abundance of suppressors to hide flash and sound location that even in your local neighborhood, we'd have a lot of information to manage trying to find out where a shot may be coming from. Each one of these windows could have a shooter inside, even in the back of the room, almost making magnification a must to locate and maneuver on, or even away from if you just want to break contact safely. On top of that, I'm going to take a wild guess that most people will be propped up or behind as much cover or concealment that they could get behind, so even if you can locate them inside 100 yards, can you take a low probability shot? We could just start spraying and praying, wasting ammo or risking injury to the innocent, or at least suppress fire until someone with a magnified optic can take a precise low probability shot, similar to SWAT and military role doctrine. Even if we leave the city and think we're going to run into the hills, you already saw how easy it is to look over hidden threats inside 100 yards. Nature can rapidly go from congested features to open terrain real quick. Now, if you're thinking that you're still never going to need magnification in any scenario whatsoever, then fair enough. We're all free to do what we want, and it is possible we could live our whole lives never actually needing anything more than a dot from both a realistic standpoint and a legal standpoint when living a civilian life. Now there's the rest of us who want to have more scenarios covered just in case, whether it be for hunting, long-range sport shooting, a foreign invasion, or even a less than ideal internal conflict, because we are also free to do so if we choose. The extra magnification is definitely a bonus, but what about that OneX in comparison? The OneX on an LPVO is totally unusable since it's never a true OneX, correct? Well, I took it through some 3-gun stages, which I had to recreate much slower while filming to let you see what I see. Saying that the OneX is bad on LPVOs is a hasty generalization. The eye box and bezel sizes vary from optic to optic based on brand and model. This AccuPoint here is one of the better 1:6 models as far as eye box goes. The Razor HD from Vortex is very similar, as well as many others that I don't even know about. I've owned a lot of 1:6s over the years, like some of the Primary Arms lower end models, numerous Strike Eagles from Vortex, the Voodoo from EOTech, and even the VCOG from Trijicon. You can't base a crappy 1X off of a low quality 1:6 for $300. When you get into premium variables, you get premium features like the AccuPoint 1:6 or the Razor 1:6. Up drills, CQB, and even home defense hasn't been any slower for me using 1X on these higher end variables. The only real annoyance between the red dot 1X and a good variable 1X is getting an instant sight picture in funky positions. Sometimes you can miss a dot in a hurry, but a longer extended tube requires more precise alignment in relation to the front and rear lens distance to get the eye box that's comparable on the fly. If I were to try and describe the amount of advantage on 1X you have using a red dot compared to an LPVO, it's only about this much better. Of course it's not the same, but it's not as far off as you may think. The real winner for the true 1X is a red dot for passive aiming under night vision. The variable will require a lot of changing diopters and focus on both the optic and your night vision to get close to it even working, but then you can't use the nods because they'd be out of focus as soon as you come off of your presentation. Basically, give up on this ever being as good as a dot. You want to add a dot on top of the variable for passive aiming, or higher off to the side. Outside of night vision, I think the OneX between the two is negligible with a good brand. I will say that the variable does have a much larger field of view compared to a dot alone on OneX, which you can see here. Now, if we were to compare the advantages for longer distance, this advantage gap starts to widen much more. In this case, all we have to do is add a magnifier right behind our dot and we're good to go. Right? Since a dot alone is vulnerable, we could add a 3x magnifier to give our eyes a superpower to locate danger. But the 6x does the job much better. Right out in the open is a luxury, and the 3x still isn't as good. On top of that, blue tinted glass and low glass clarity can be seen here. This clearer glass and extra magnification also helps when a threat is in concealment and lower light conditions to locate. Even if we add a 3x magnifier, with glass that doesn't compare to a high-end variable, we may run into issues finding our target. It's hard enough to see the yellow bulldozer through this fall brush, let alone the threat standing next to it here. The 6x increases the likelihood of gathering information and details, and the 3x is still hard to see that the person is next to this dozer. This is only 80 meters, again inside of 100 yards, and this person could have smoked you if they were the magnified one and you were not. Here in this morning fog, a 1x dot doesn't allow us to see very far. Adding a magnifier does help penetrate into the distance a bit more, but 6x on a variable does this even better. Distance and finer details emerge the more magnification we have, including the ACOG. The magnifier, although a good addition to have, and its ability to disconnect and throw in a pouch keeps the weight off the rifle, isn't quite as good as the 6x on a variable. Even if we take the 6x and see how far we can identify things, you might be surprised. From this ridge here, clear over to this hillside, is about 877 meters to this house. On only 6x, you can gather a decent amount of information and track movement and one's intentions. Can you gather smaller, finer details like a weapon on a person? Probably not. It's not as good as having a higher magnification, but it's not bad in comparison to 3x or no X at all. Here, if we compare a 4x ACOG to a 3 to 9 power scope on 9x, you can see much more details like what someone may be holding or doing. This is at 500 yards, and if not for my low quality footage, you could even write down things like license plate numbers and identify what kind of weapons a person or group may be working with. Again, those of you who don't find a use case for higher magnification outside of sport shooting and hunting have either clicked off this video already or have stuck around because your inner caveman realizes it may not be a bad idea to have some higher magnification handy. If the world continues to spiral into chaos, you'd be surprised what kind of distances are all around you in your daily life. Again, it's all about being ready for anything, and just think how many people out there already have magnification and have mastered it. On this city street, you can simply measure the varying distances on a map, and a simple turn down the street will show you a line of sight of 450 meters to the end, and if we do a 180, another 800 meters the other way. In a commercial shopping area, distances vary as well. To the corner of this building may be around your 100 limit, but a small turn to the right leads us out to 400 meters to the railroad line. For the bug-out types, even the great outdoors leaves just as many concealed distances that won't be conveniently marked out for us like a shooting range. Without a cell phone or internet, how would you know what hold to use for this structure here? Being able to range estimate is a pretty handy skill set to have, and the red dot magnifier has a limited selection to do this. Primary Arms has the Pegasus reticle inside a magnifier so that you can range estimate and then use a proper hold out the distance similar to the ranging capabilities of a BDC reticle. One of the shortcomings of using a BDC reticle is that it's based off of human sizing. Some magnified optics include a mill system inside to measure objects like the ACOG if you need to measure distances on non-human things. Measuring other objects like vehicle rim sizes, house doors, and other non-human objects can be done much better knowing the mil radian or minute of angle system when estimating target size to distance, but that's way too much to include in this video. Just know that attaching a magnifier to a dot doesn't compare to using a variable power scope with a reticle that has more utility, especially when your battery on your dot dies. If you might add a magnified optic to your collection, let's cover some quick things to think about. One of the cool things about the AR platform is that you don't have to go out and buy a whole second rifle and ditch your red dot setup. Luckily, we can just buy a quality upper and it only takes 2 quick pins and voila, you have a magnified rifle. Just stick your CQB dot upper in your pack or throw it in the vehicle. Remember, The optic is zeroed to the upper in that barrel, not the lower. If you're going to go the LPVO route, you're going to have to decide if you want a second or rear focal plane optic or a first or front focal plane optic. If you don't know, a second or rear focal plane has the reticle in the rear of the optic and does not grow in size when raising the magnification levels. Obviously, the first or front focal will look very small on OneX and grow in size much larger at higher magnification, most of the time revealing more information hidden at the OneX. We'll start with the simpler rear or second focal plane optic. If you use a super simple reticle like a duplex or crosshair, you just zero at a distance of your liking just like a red dot and use holds. This is basically a red dot that can go to higher magnification and has a way to aim even without battery power. If you're not sure what distance to zero this at, go watch my best red dot zero video. I simply zero mine at 36 yards so that I have a 6 to 7 inch rise and fall out to 300 yards and a hold for 400 and 500. Being able to magnify up to 6x makes the hold method much easier to pinpoint a proper, accurate hold.
Way easier.
In my older videos, I mentioned that I also mark my turrets for the 400, 500, and 600 yard points of impact if I need to dial for low probability shots. You can, however, get a second focal plane optic with mil dots, MOA dots, and even BDC options. Just know that these ranging/angular measuring systems are only to be used on the full magnification level of the optic. To illustrate why, let's first use a BDC reticle on 6x over a target at 300 yards. Since the target is at 300 yards, we would use this point of aim here to impact at this distance. Since a second focal plane reticle stays the same size regardless of the magnification, and the first focal plane reticle shrinks and expands as you zoom in and out, making it kinda small to see on OneX. Now let's leave both of the optics on OneX, but zoom in closer so we can see the targets and explain why a second focal BDC won't work properly. If you look at the first focal plane reticle on the right, which also shrinks in size as you dial it back, the holds look exactly like the second focal plane optic did on 6-power. If we mark the impact points on the BDC for 100, 200, and 300, and then correlate them onto the large second focal BDC reticle that stays large on 1x, you can see that the 300 would impact here. If you tried to use the BDC on 1x, you would go completely over the target, risking injury to the innocent. MRAD and MOA reticles do the exact same thing in the second focal plane, so don't forget that the reticle information on a second focal plane optic is to be used at the max magnification only. Technically, by the time you need magnification, then you may also need to use the reticle to range estimate and correct for drops anyway, so it's not too awful. Now, if you can't stand the sensitive eye box being forced to use this on max magnification, then you may want to consider the first focal plane, not only so that you can dial it back a bit with a reticle that still correlates correct, but other information like win holds or impact correction markers also don't work on a second focal plane optic unless it's also at its max magnification. Too much to explain in this video, but things like aging eyesight or a disgust for sensitive eye boxes may persuade you to go to the first focal plane. Since the reticle will be accurate on all levels of magnification, you'll be able to dial it back to 4 or 5x, providing you with a less sensitive eye box while still having a usable BDC or whatever reticle you prefer. This will also become essential if you get into longer range shooting where everything has to correlate correctly, or you don't want to dial as much. Or just get an ACOG. Let's talk about virtue and how to be virtuous. This is a learned characteristic, so anyone is capable. If we create a spectrum called temperature and plot out extreme vices like the freezing cold and blazing hot, we could have a problem. Each end can kill you in excess, so we live somewhere in survivable ranges here. Imagine you and a lady friend are in a room together and she says, "It's cold in here," as she shows you her cold chilled skin as evidence, and you reply back with shock, "What do you mean it's cold? I'm burning up in here." You even provide evidence with the sweat on your forehead to prove your case. Now just ask yourself, is the room objectively and factually hot or cold? The room is a set temperature, and your reality to that temperature is based on perspective. 3 true realities can exist at the same time, which may surprise some, as they are convinced that only their freezing reality is the true one, and the rest of the world should bend to their personal truth. We live in a world that has been losing its virtue for quite some time, where everyone thinks their own reality is the only true one, and others should bend to its will. Now let's relate this to optics so we have a more virtuous approach and don't run around sounding like jackwagons with unbendable perspectives. Let's create a new spectrum like temperature, but call it distance capability, in yards particularly. We'll plot out iron sights, a red dot, a fixed prism, and a low power variable. The irons are good up close and even out to distance with good marksmanship, overall favoring closer range, unless you run night vision. When we factor in concealed or camouflage targets, some of the extended range isn't as good in reality versus shooting range conditions like bright targets and known distances. The red dot is actually faster up close, with easier both eyes open shooting and a finer point of aim when shooting out to distance, slightly better than irons in my opinion in real use, including usable night vision. If we add a magnifier to this combo, we actually extend the longer range capability of the dot, but not as much as you think without a reticle for range estimation and drops like mentioned throughout the video. Onto the prism optics like the ACOG, we get a lacking close range performance in comparison to a red dot, bad passive night vision use, and not much of a super long range utility. Still better than a dot magnifier out to distance, although a more balanced mid-range setup. We need to add a dot up top for better OneX performance and passive night vision performance, giving us a bit more versatility, arguably better than a dot magnifier combo. Lastly, we can plot out the LPVO. Not as good as a red dot on OneX, although close, and much better out to extended distances than all of the others, especially with a good reticle. The LPVO is in existence because we seek to find virtue in capability. We don't know what situation we'll ever be in, and that's the appeal of the low power variable, of course with some trade-offs. These spectrums were based around distance capability, and if we change them to a weight spectrum, everything changes. Weight might not seem like much to worry about, but spending a lot of time under a presentation will have your arms giving up without your permission. An optic may not sound heavy on paper, but the further forward an optic has to sit for the proper eye relief, the quicker you'll wish the world never invented optics at all. The further away from the fulcrum point the optic is, the more it will weigh in reality unless you can mount it further back, like the ACOG. The iron sights and dots are actually the lightest, and the LPVO is the heaviest, a likely downside. The proper way to talk about optic configurations is actually more like an attribute diagram. If we take features like the weight here by optic and plot them out on this diagram, the center being bad and then outward being really good, we can then add our original spectrum, this time called long range, again center being low ranking and outward being better at this attribute. If we add a few more attributes like a good OneX, cost, durability, night vision use, and build quality, you get a much better picture of these setups and how people argue on their behalf. If we take the red dot diagram specifically, that has a not so good long range effectiveness, we can add a magnifier to bring it up a bit, with a trade-off to weight getting worse. Even the prism optic diagram has a bad 1x value, which can be improved by adding a dot up top, improving its night vision use, or a side dot improving its day 1x use, affecting the weight attribute just a little. This also brings up the cost depending on which microdot you go with, of course. These diagrams basically encompass capability when we try to find the best do-it-all setup. This is what we actually want and chase after, but it's not realistic. Companies are trying to get us there, but technology is limited, and even if we got close, you'd be talking about aerospace prices going off the chart. If you have any of the optic combinations we talked about, don't run out and buy new stuff unless you know for a fact you need the capability. I run multiple setups every time I go to the range, and I still don't even have a favorite. They all do things better in different scenarios, and sometimes I just don't feel like lugging around a heavier configuration. Sometimes I'll show up to a long range and regret that my magnifier can't even see the impacts beyond 300 yards, even when spotting for friends. Screenshot my diagrams if you have to and decide which features are the most important to you, like long range capability or weight, and go train as much as you can with that setup. If we weren't planning this as individuals, it would be much easier to just have a team with a few guys set up with CQB rifles, a few mid-range team leaders with prism optics, backed by some DMR guys with variables, or even longer-range sniper setups, and holy crap. I just described a military unit structure to you, and now this should all make sense. The Marine Corps, however, has switched recently to less specific weapons to a general setup in the M27 IAR. One general setup for the SOL, the rifleman, and the designated marksman. They're running the newest experiment to see if everyone having a general purpose setup is the way to go versus previous unit role designs. As many of us could end up being a one-man army, maybe the general purpose is the way to go, and you'll have to decide which configuration is best for you. I'm building up my entire video series to eventually see what our current top runners are for the best individual all-purpose rifle with as minimal trade-offs and low score attributes as I can. I have a few secret optic combinations in the works I want to try before I make any hasty conclusions. So in the meantime, I want to say thanks for watching and be sure to stick around for the next few videos. The best way to see them post and join the live premiere chat is to subscribe. I put the third-person intro without any talking in the description if you want to watch it again for those who got a good laugh out of it. I'll see you on the next video, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.